This presentation is a study of clergy sexual abuse, one of the most prevalent moral failures within the church. Wherever there is an imbalance of power within a relationship, there are opportunities for the power dynamics of that relationship to be abused. This presentation will look specifically at the moral failure of evangelical apologist Ravi Zacharias and RZIM, the organization that enabled and overlooked his abusive behavior. Looking at this specific example, we will then offer some reflections on how to prevent sexual abuse, including what has and hasn't worked. We start with a quick look at clergy sexual abuse throughout history. Clergy sexual abuse has existed in the church in some form almost since the very beginning, since the inception of the church. One research study found that while the church verbally committed to to preventative measures, while they historically knew about abuse, quote, the will to implement preventative measures has consistently remained absent. So this is something that is not just true of the 21st century church, the 20th century church. This is a problem that has plagued the church throughout the course of its history. We have 2,000 years in which we can learn from the failures of the last 2,000 years and begin to move forward. Paul Isley writes that although the recent revelations of the clergy sexual abuse suggest an unusual and recent epidemic among the Catholic Church, the historical record suggests this difficulty has plagued the church over the centuries. We find that clergy sexual abuse has existed in every faith tradition throughout denominations. In the Catholic Church in 2004, 4% of active Catholic priests have been the subject of a sexual abuse allegation. And while this scandal in the Catholic Church is not the beginning of sexual abuse, it really was the beginning of modern awareness of clergy sexual abuse and has led to, in the past 20 plus years now, a large change in how clergy sexual abuse has been talked about. It's finally coming into the limelight. It's finally being talked about, and maybe we can heal from this and we can prevent this. You see that in 2015, the UK Methodist Church issued an official apology for thousands of instances of abuse spanning decades. Earlier this year, a prominent Canadian Anabaptist megachurch pastor, Brooksy Cavey, was found to be guilty of sexual abuse within his congregation. Also in 2022, the largest United States denomination, the Southern Baptist Convention, was found to have systematically covered up clergy sexual abuse and to harass sexual abuse victims. One study from 2009 by Mark Chavez and Diana Garland indicate that 1 in 30 women who regularly attend church services have been the subject of sexual advances by clergy. I want to talk for a second about a biblical instance of sexual abuse. It's not clergy sexual abuse. David was not clergy, but he was a spiritual leader as well as a political leader within the nation. And we know that in 2 Samuel chapter 11 and 12, we get the story of David's rape of Bathsheba. And what we see when we kind of zoom out from that storyline is that is the central narrative, is the central element of the entire story of 2 Samuel. At the beginning of 2 Samuel, David wins the civil war. He succeeds Saul as king. He captures Jerusalem and makes it his capital. He brings the Ark of the Covenant into the city. He wins all of his battles, defeats all of his enemies, and the land has peace. And then he rapes Bathsheba. In this instance of sexual abuse begins the downfall of David's family and will lead to the downfall of the nation. 2 Samuel 13, David's son Amnon rapes his half-sister Tamar and is then killed out of revenge by her brother Absalom. Absalom then leads a civil war against David, and Absalom is ultimately killed. And then in the end of 2 Samuel, chapters 20 through 24, David faces other rebellions and moral failures. David's family is destroyed and the nation is destabilized. And only a generation later, it's going to split into two. And I spend time on this because we have clear evidence that power lacking in accountability becomes corrupt. If it was true for David, who was called a man after God's own heart, 1 Samuel 13:14, then it can certainly be true for spiritual leaders today. And all of this will have implications for our spiritual leadership. The effect of sexual abuse on leadership, the effect of clergy sexual abuse, there are at least three things we can talk about, and first and foremost and far and above everything else is the harm that clergy sexual abuse does to its victims. McLaughlin writes that as a direct result of clergy sexual abuse, survivors often believe they are not worthy of God's love, and they stay away from both the church and God. Clergy sexual abuse causes spiritual harm, and it causes individuals to not be connected to God. Further, many survivors report experiencing PTSD and other mental health issues, such as eating disorders, anxiety, other things of that nature. So the harm that is done to victims is physical, it is emotional, it is mental, it is spiritual, it is all encompassing. We cannot understate how harmful this behavior is, and how when we have this conversation about the effects of clergy sexual abuse, it has to be about the victims first. However, we also move to the general public, in that as a result of this, people's perception of clergy have been are not as good as it used to be, and I would say rightfully so. Only 36% in Gallup's annual poll, this is their 2022 poll, only 36% of people perceived clergy as being highly honest or ethical. Quote from the study was that in earlier decades, clergy were among the best rated professions for their honesty and ethics, but a series of sexual abuse scandals over the years has undermined public trust in the profession. So Gallup specifically links clergy sexual abuse to the lack of trust people have for clergy. And when people don't trust you, they're not going to follow you. So participation in church also has a direct correlation. Lack of participation in church, the decline of participation in church, is a direct result of sexual abuse scandals and clergy sexual abuse. Sexual abuse scandals have caused 37% of Catholics to reconsider their affiliation with the church, while another study found, quote, a significant decline in religious participation as a result of the scandals. Not necessarily just alongside, not corollary to, not concomitant with, but a direct result from the scandals. One scholar, Natalia Imperatoria Lee, opined that you have these very top-down patriarchal institutions representing a kind of power that civil society has left behind, indicating that there is some belief that patriarchal, hierarchical institutions that hold power and create a wide power differential is the type of institution that is likely to also engender abuse. We come now to a specific discussion of Ravi Zacharias and RZIM, Ravi Zacharias International Ministries. Ravi was an evangelical apologist who had an international ministry focusing on the intellectual element of the Christian faith. Zacharias came to prominence when he spoke at the Billy Graham International Conference for Itinerant Evangelists in 1983. The next year, he would found his organization, Ravi Zacharias International Ministries, and by the 2020s, the ministry would employ hundreds of people throughout the world. Ravi was one of the most respected and revered figures in American evangelicalism. He was instrumental in my personal faith development and in my personal call to ministry. And yet it became obvious that Ravi engaged in sexually abusive behavior over a number of years, and that RZIM turned a blind eye to the red flags indicating abuse, and through that enabled Ravi to continually sexually abuse women. In 2017, Ravi sued a Canadian couple for what he claimed was attempted extortion, alleging that his friendly correspondence with the wife had evolved over the course of 2016 and led to him being sent, quote, unwanted, offensive, sexually explicit language and photographs. He ended up issuing an apology, saying that he failed to exercise wise caution and to protect himself from even the appearance of impropriety, and for that he was profoundly sorry. However, the couple actually they claim the opposite, stating that they were not the predators in this relationship, but they were the victims. That this was a relationship that Ravi sought out, and these were explicit conversations and photographs that he engaged in and asked for. Shortly after his death, other claims of sexual abuse began to surface. The ministry initially denied these claims, but did launch an independent investigation by Guidepost Solutions. And at the beginning of 2021, Guidepost Solutions released that report, and they were able to not only corroborate those initial claims of sexual abuse, but also uncovered many other examples of sexual abuse as well, and other toxic elements within the organization. The report found, quote, significant evidence of sexual misconduct, and that misconduct ranged from indecent exposure to rape. 4 therapists reported that he would either touch his genitals or ask them to touch his genitals as part of the massage. 5 therapists reported that he touched or rubbed them inappropriately, and some therapists reported even more serious and sustained sexual assaults that evolved over time, with one individual describing sexual intercourse and rape. Ravi also used ministry funds to financially support some of the therapists that he was abusing, and the report also discusses other areas of sexual misconduct, concluding, quote, we are confident that we uncovered sufficient evidence to conclude that Mr. Zacharias engaged in sexual misconduct. Ravi's sexual grooming behaviors followed an established pattern of behavior that has been noted by researchers. And there are 7 stages. Greg Cinnamon has a model called the 7-stage model of adult sexual grooming. And we're going to go through those stages one by one and see just how Ravi became a textbook example of adult sexual grooming. So stage 1 is victim selection. Abusers are going to find individuals who are vulnerable for psychological, emotional reasons, because of family circumstances, financial circumstances. And in the report on Ravi, quote, some therapists described a process that began with probing conversation and him asking about their families and backgrounds, often delving deeply into personal issues, such as financial struggles or emotionally broken backgrounds. Ravi was using his background as a pastor, as a counselor, in order to select and target his victims. Stage 2 is planning. Once a predator has selected a target, the next stage in the grooming process is to get to know the target personally, to gather information about them, and to gather information about their needs and their vulnerabilities. A primary location for Ravi's abuse was at 2 spas, where he was a silent investor. He also used his position as spiritual leader to engage in these conversations that eventually led to requests for sexual favors. So he had a plan in which to discover what these people needed, how to get them alone, and how to justify a situation wherein he was in a state of undress. And that led to the 3rd stage. The 3rd stage is developing trust. Ravi uses his position as a spiritual leader to gain the trust of some of his victims. From the report, quote, the witnesses told us the relationship began as a normal massage therapist-client relationship, and she came to think of him as a father figure. The therapist he reportedly targeted for more than a massage discussed a similar modus operandi of building their trust and making them feel at ease. So step 3, he has now gotten them into this place of rather intimate touch, in a place where he is normalizing physical touch and normalizing some element of sexuality. He is gaining their trust. And then 4th is credibility. He goes to meet a need for them. Predators will use the information that they've gathered, the trust they have developed, to ingratiate themselves to the victim in some manner. According to the report, a victim told us that, quote, the more we saw each other, the more he became comfortable and wanted to go further. She told us that she felt obligated to do what he asked because of the financial support he provided her. The 5th stage of adult sexual grooming is priming. The report indicates that Ravi would begin his massages fully nude, and then he would uncover himself if he was covered up by the massage therapist. So he's priming the individual for a sexual or sexualized experience, slowly escalating his behaviors from something that might be seen as culturally and insensitive or inappropriate, all the way up to now overtly sexual. Many therapists said that his behavior would slowly escalate as time went on, that as he grew closer to them, as he gained their trust, he would begin to prepare them for a sexual relationship, which they would then instigate. Step 6 is instigating the sexual abuse. 4 therapists reported he would either touch his genitals or ask him to touch theirs. You see the list here. The Mr. Zacharias engaged in sexual intercourse. He instigated a sexually abusive relationship with these women. And then lastly is they try to maintain the relationship. The predators attempt to maintain the abuse, and they attempt to maintain secrecy regarding the abuse. One victim reported that he warned her to not ever speak out against him, or she would be responsible for the, quote, millions of souls whose salvation would be lost if his reputation was damaged. Ravi also maintained his abuse by creating this toxic culture of unquestioned loyalty within his organization. Employees who questioned his behavior were treated poorly, were ignored, marginalized, and accused of disloyalty. We start with what hasn't worked. Traditionally, the church has responded to clergy sexual abuse with silence, with deflection, with cover-up. For example, when Ravi was accused of sexually abusive behavior in 2017, they settled the matter out of court, they signed an NDA, and that was the end of it. The story never really came out. There was no discussion of the matter whatsoever. Some researchers, like Prasad, have argued that NDAs are prevalent in silencing victims of sexual abuse, and that more needs to be done to regulate these NDAs to make sure that silence cannot be bought from either side. Next is deflection. An example of deflection is that the Southern Baptist Convention for many years downplayed its sexual abuse claims, with one leader calling it, quote, a satanic scheme to completely distract us from evangelism. It turned out that it was much more than that they knew of the abuse at the time, but were covering it up, were downplaying it, were trying to keep it quiet, and deflecting it by saying that it was actually a scheme against them rather than evil that they were perpetrating. And the third way that we've tried to deal with clergy sexual abuse is to cover it up. And we have seen that throughout history, that the Catholic Church in particular covered up sexual abuse by moving abusive clergy to different cities, to different countries, and was able to prevent stories of abuse from getting out that way. All of this fits with this typical narrative of the position and the authority of the spiritual leader being upheld over the voice of the victims. Those in power want to remain in power, and so they have a bias, both conscious and unconscious, toward minimizing any claims of abuse. So what can we do? What can we do that could work? At the institutional level, here are some ideas. These are by all means not exhaustive. These are fairly elementary beginnings to what we can do to prevent clergy sexual abuse. And the first practical idea is to have background checks for any paid or volunteer leader, anyone who is going to be in any sort of leadership capacity or authority should undergo a criminal background check. Organizations like Protect My Ministry offer background checks tailored to church needs, although there are several other different background check companies, different ways of doing this. And background checks should be periodically renewed in every 4 years or so, probably should be redone, just as a way of saying that we're taking this seriously. We're going to make sure that there is nothing in the past that would prevent this person or be a red flag for this person to be in leadership or be in ministry. And second is education. I think education is probably the most important thing that we can do. Church leaders and laity need to be educated on what is and what is not appropriate behavior, and how inappropriate behavior can and should be reported. Church policies on abuse prevention should be clear. They shouldn't just be in a church manual, though they should be written down. They shouldn't be verbal. They should be written down, but they should also be talked about. They should be talked about maybe quarterly within the church, from the pulpit, not just in church meetings. And then there are third-party organizations like Darkness to Light that offer appropriate prevention training, good third-party training that is not just inside the church and even not just meant for churches, can often help churches have a better understanding, a wider understanding of what is necessary. Education is so important. Knowing what red flags there are to certain relationships, knowing where boundaries should be set, knowing how to recognize when boundaries have been broken, or when there are red flags, or what sort of behaviors are appropriate, are so important. And then the third thing that we can do at an institutional level is have mandatory reporting. Sexual abusers have felt freedom to abuse because the institution and the culture has protected them. Churches must be willing to refer abuse claims for outside investigation, whether that is a criminal investigation if the situation warrants, or a civil investigation, and then based on that result, it might become a criminal investigation. Next, we look at what can work on the cultural level. And the first thing that I want to talk about is that we must use the language of abuse. We must call the act what it is. When Brooksy Cavey resigned from his leadership position due to his moral failing, he called it an extramarital affair. His victim called it clergy sexual abuse. Whenever there is an imbalance of power, as there is between clergy and parishioner, we must use the language of abuse. And I would also say we must tend toward using the language of the victim rather than the language of the predator. Cavey's victim requested that the language clergy sexual abuse be used whenever his church was talking about the event, but the church did not adhere to that request, preferring to call it an abuse of power. He preferred to call it an extramarital affair. There's all these words and all this language that is used to soften the sin, that is used to indicate that it might have been a mutual fault. We can't allow that. We must use the language of abuse and clearly say this was an abusive relationship. There was an imbalance of power. This is clergy sexual abuse. Second, and much more nuanced, this is much more difficult. We must desexualize mixed gender friendship. Christian culture, particularly evangelical culture, seems to have a problem with mixed gender friendship, thinking that eventually it must become romantic or it must become sexual. The Billy Graham rule, which Billy Graham instituted, it had really good intentions. He stated that male leaders should not be one-on-one with any woman, not their wife. And he did this because he saw a lot of itinerant evangelists who were with women, not their wife, and were engaging in clergy sexual abuse. The pro of this is that it prevents abuse, it prevents even abuse allegations. But the downside of this, the con of this, is that it treats women like they are a sexual object. Caitlin Beatty, writing about this rule, she writes about this rule in the context of former Vice President Mike Pence following this rule. She says that it arises from a broken view of the sexes. Men are lustful beasts that must be contained, while women are objects of desire that must be hidden away. Offering the Pence rule as a solution to male predation is like saying, I can't meet with you one-on-one, otherwise I might eventually assault you. If that's the case, we have far deeper problems around men and power than any personal conduct rule can solve. Legalism is not going to solve this thing. At a cultural level, churches must find the balance between protecting the flock and setting up strict legalistic boundaries that do harm in other ways. Christian culture must teach men and women how to live in community with one another as friends. If the only mixed gender relationship that one has is a sexual marital relationship with one's spouse, then of course any attempt at a mixed gender friendship is going to seem like a threat to that marriage relationship. However, if men and women are taught to live together in community and non-sexual friendships are normalized and men are taught not to perceive women as sexual objects, then this is really where we will go the farthest in preventing clergy sexual abuse and sexual abuse of all kinds. And then that turns us to specifically for RZIM. Is there a path forward for RZIM leaders? And I give this section even though RZIM seems to have pretty much dissolved. The organization still legally exists. However, they are not doing anything. The CEO of the organization, Sarah Zacharias Davis, has resigned and had been starting her own organization. However, there has been no information anywhere concerning that. So I offer this as specifically a path forward for RZIM leaders. The Guidepost Solutions investigation concluded that, quote, we believe that RZIM's leadership and cultural weaknesses stem from the devotion and loyalty to Zacharias shown by the ministry's leaders, directors, employees, and followers. The culture of the company was so wrapped up in Ravi, even given the name, that they could not see how this man could do anything wrong. So first thing that they need to do, in whatever context that these leaders find themselves in, they need to make sure there's an accountability structure for leadership. Because while there were individuals hired to provide accountability for Ravi, the power differential in those relationships made the attempt only a ruse that hid abusive behavior. He was legalistically going by the book to show that accountability was being maintained, but it was really just a way to, there was a facade that allowed the lie to continue. Second, I would say that they need to discourage and avoid nepotism and family structures. Ravi's wife, Margie, served as the chief cultural officer of RZIM, and she was on the board of directors. His daughter, Sarah Zacharias Davis, served as CEO. His other daughter, Naomi, headed the sub-organization Wellspring International. The direct involvement of his family allowed Ravi to avoid accountability because there was a patriarchal structure that placed him at the top. So there was no accountability. There was a hierarchical structure that placed him at the top. There was a patriarchal structure that placed him at the top. And lastly, they need to make sure they create transparency. The board of directors for RZIM were not publicly known. They were kept anonymous, and its communication strategies were often unclear. Going forward, any leadership must be publicly named and be publicly accountable for the organization under which they are serving. To conclude, The fall of Ravi Zacharias and RZIM is a shocking blow to evangelical Christianity. Ravi was someone who I personally considered to be instrumental to my own faith formation. A review of the organization and of Ravi's activities is what was shocking, shows that what was shocking should not have been a shock, that the red flags had been there for years for those within the organization. Success, power, wealth, a lack of accountability all contributed to Ravi's moral failure. And his story is not alone. As we've seen, there are people from church leaders and clergy from all sorts of different contexts, all sorts of different denominations, at all different points in history. This story, like so many others, is a cautionary tale for church and parachurch organizations. Clergy sexual abuse is not new. It is a millennia-old problem. The church has never dealt with it positively. We must change that. Clergy sexual abuse devastates the lives of their victims. It's directly led to decreased trust in clergy, directly led to decreased participation in organized church. We must change that. In the past, churches have denied, deflected, and covered up clergy sexual abuse. It has not worked, and we must change that. Instead, we have to work at the institutional level to create and to enforce sexual abuse prevention policies and to educate clergy and lay people on them. These are things we can do. We can change that. And then at the cultural level, we must use the language of abuse and we must promote the creation of healthy mixed gender relationships as an alternative to abusive ones. We can change that. Churches must do better. Our public and our private actions, our cover-ups, our justifications of sin, our lack of accountability and consequences have all led to this public distrust in Christianity and clergy that has harmed thousands and thousands of people. It must be a stated goal of any church body to lament these failures and to offer a markedly different model of church, a markedly different model of leadership.